Well, awesome, Kirk. Thanks for coming on the show. So, the main reason I wanted to talk to you is because I've been thinking a lot about art generally, literature in particular, since I have a novel coming out at some point next year. And one of the things that
Congratulations, by the way.
oh, thank you. Although I just got an unexpected set of rewrites from the
Mm.
publisher. So that's going to take up a bunch of unanticipated part of my vacation. We're now recording this towards the end of December 2020. But, one of the things that I've thought a lot about is, there's a concept of like an impoverished sex life, but people never talk about an impoverished art life. And I think that that is extremely widespread, even by people who want to get more out of art. That is, I'll, I think I told this when I was on your show, I didn't not really respond much to the visual arts. I could look at a painting and go, okay, that's nice. And then our mutual friend, Luke Travers, basically laid out like, here's a process that you can go through. Here's what your mind should be doing so that your soul can eventually be really captivated by something that otherwise would just be kind of like oh, that looks interesting, or oh, that looks cool. So I want to explore that. But before we get into that topic, maybe you could just kind of fill in some of your background and how you got to where you are now. Because I don't even remember when you and I met. I know
ARI, we worked together at ARI actually.
that was the first time. Okay.
Yeah, so I don't think we met before that. Yeah, I had a whole bunch of ARI intellectuals, but I don't come to my campus when I was a student. I don't think you were one that was able to make it. Conflict of stuff. But when I went to ARI, of course, that's when I think we met there, which was during the launching of the Ayn Rand Institute campus, and that was an interesting time. But so I think that's when we met, I believe, for the first time, because I was in Denver before that.
Okay.
And that's where I went to college. I don't think I had only met an objectivist 2 years before, like at the beginning of college, which I went to college late. I didn't go to college until I was like 23. I was actually in sales from 18 to 23, trying to make enough money to go to college and pay most of my way through. So that's kind of my origin in I guess meeting you. But it wasn't, in terms of getting to where I am today, I am, I consider myself right now in two fields, which is a mistake, but it's something that I'm trying to work on, and I've been trying to work on for a long time. And that's why I have this, I'm editor of this magazine, but I really think of that as like just a way to put my work that I'm doing in literature as a writer of fiction and nonfiction, and then also as a teacher of literature. And like you were saying with Luke, one of the things I've discovered is the necessity of teaching. Like, I can't just, here's a work of literature, let me just give you a few thoughts. I have to teach people like how to even read to a large degree. Like, that's a big portion of what I do with poetry. It's just people they're not used to it. It's not their fault. I was the same way. I didn't fall in love with poetry until Leonard Peikoff's course that I took when I was 28. I would listen to it many times, Poems I Like and Why. And that completely just opened up like, oh, poetry is something that actually can be enjoyable. Like I never thought of that before. And so I really got into reading hundreds and hundreds of poems. And at this point I've read epic poems and I've read a lot of stuff. And it's like, there is a training that's required. So that's one thing that I think of all art is it's not automatic, just like anything that uses the mind. You can't just look at it and just expect it to be, passively, meaning just kind of like shoots from your eyeballs all of a sudden. Like it takes intellectual work, just like with anything worthwhile, I think.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I agree with that in essence, but I think if you think the contact that people have with art most typically is going to be in the form of popular music and TV and movies. And it's not exactly that you have to be passive to enjoy those. On the contrary, and yet you can get a lot relatively passively, right? You can feel a lot of emotions just watching, a film like Shawshank Redemption, or listening to, like Nirvana or Kendrick Lamar. Like there's kind of it's almost designed so that at least um, a pretty good amount of value is right there in the service for the taking, right?
Mm.
And so I think what often happens is that people then will turn to something that's more demanding, and they don't know what to do. They approach it with the same sort of thing and they go, I mean, that's cool, I guess, or I don't get it at all. I mean, I had this with classical music, right? Because I was, grew up on popular music and rock
Mm.
music. And I heard this, and the only associations I had with it were from childhood on Looney Tunes,
Yeah, yeah.
which is actually a kind of negative factor because you associate some of the most beautiful music with like Bugs Bunny hitting somebody in the head. But so I think the point I was making here is just that um, people are used to kind of a passive form of experiencing some forms of artistic pleasure, and so it's kind of a shock. They don't even know that there is a method that one could go through to get something even more out of more demanding pieces.
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that there's levels to the enjoyment and pleasure you can get from the imaginative intellectual life. And I do think of it as pleasure. The if you remember when you're a kid, and you may do this, I don't want to say you particularly, I don't know. It's very hard to assess the inner world of other people and how robust it or lacking it may be. But when I think about my childhood, a lot of it I remember, um, you know, my dad was a salesperson and sometimes he would take me places, but I'd have to wait in the car while he went in and did stuff. And I remember kind of like going into this fantasy world, and there was a real physical pleasure in going into that fantasy world. And I do think that that particular skill, to the degree people have it, is something that has to be developed. I think to some degree you get that when you're talking about with popular fiction. I think there is a kind of playing on popular images, popular ideas, popular feelings that you can kind of skim the surface. I do like popular fiction. I'm not trying to attack it, but it is, in my view, definitely a skimming of the surface, and it lacks you can still get an emotional feeling without doing any work. And I think when you learn to do the work for more profound pieces, your ability to experience it and your ability to enjoy that higher level, I would call it an elevated realm of enjoying art, that starts to happen more versus when you listen to a song and it feels good and then it's gone, or you watch a movie. And I remember dating a girl years ago, and we left a movie and I was starting to talk to her about it. I was asking her questions and, oh, what'd you think of this? What'd you think of that? And she looked at me as like, I've never walked out of a movie and talked about it. And I think that's most people's common experience, even with pop cultures. You watch something, you feel it, it's passive. And then if someone asked you questions about it 2 days later, you'd be like, I don't know, it was a good movie. A guy killed another guy. And it's very vague. And that, so I think people, even with stuff that's popular, I think even there, because they don't have the training, they don't get more out of it.
I agree. I mean, I remember I was shocked. So this is like my whole, youthful experience was you'd go to a movie and you walk out and be like, what'd you think? Pretty good. And then you keep walking, right? Like it was that. And then I would meet people who it wasn't kind of like an analyzing in some sort of, how would you put it, academic exercise of, I guess I have to sit around and identify the characterization and theme. And it was this passionate sense to untangle, what is this really about? What was driving this character? Why did he or she do this? And what I realized was, oh, asking those kinds of questions gives you a deeper enjoyment. And the example that I always give for this are, something like, there's two examples that come to mind. One, it might be less relatable for people, and it's certainly not an area where I'm a specialist, but like my friend Adam, our mutual friend Adam, is wine connoisseur. And it's, if you're unfamiliar, you drink something and you're like, oh, that's pretty good, or it's pretty bad. It's like, walking out of the movie theater and say, hey, what'd you think of that? I guess it was okay. But it's once you develop a context and you can really get, okay, these are the different flavors going on. This is what's working. This is what's not. This is what's integrating. This is what's not. It's a much richer experience. Or for me, the better example is like, if I took a friend who was unfamiliar to a baseball game and let's say they knew the basic rules and they could kind of get, okay, the one side's winning, the one side's losing. That is not at all like the experience of, you're somebody who understands the rules. You know why that fielder just took 2 steps to the left when that batter came up, and you know why that batter is actually waiting, through the first bit. You get the subtleties, you see more, and therefore your enjoyment's deeper. And I think you're right that even for like popular entertainment, you can unlock much more of that by being active minded.
Yeah, and I would caution, like, one thing about that analogy that I'm a little bit cautious about is it makes me think of that you need to have a technical understanding of, cinematography and editing in order to appreciate a movie. And I was a film major, a film production major at the University of Colorado. And one of the things that I've realized is that there's this dichotomy where it's like you either just kind of enjoy, movies and shut up about it, or you're this kind of film connoisseur that's like, oh, it's let's compare it to Citizen Kane and the way that they had these kinds of dolly shot, and it's like that's like how it's experienced for people of when you come to intellectualize it or engage with it. And that's the way I think of art, is that you want to engage with it. You want to you don't have to know all the technical details of literary devices and how they did XYZ, how the camera moved and what that means. That, for me, I do get a little bit of enjoyment in learning about that, but it's not necessary for just a normal person to, who's not majoring and focusing on this, to enjoy painting, poetry, literature, music, all those types of art forms. And this is what when you were on our show, Surprised by Art with Luke and Kirk, one of the things, that Luke does really well, especially, is, going through and just looking at the details. And that's all just by doing that one little thing, right? It's not even knowing the technique of how they did it. It's just what is physically in front of you, and just observe. And that's it. And this is true even of literature, of reading poetry. Is like, I tell people, read the poem out loud and just get a sense for it. And then read it carefully and observe, what do you think that means? What do you think? And it does take a little bit of work a lot of times, but it's valuable. I argue, at least, and I think that it's incredibly important as getting the fullness out of life. And that's how I think of it is there's that line by Francis Bacon, reading maketh a full man. He's talking about all reading, but I take that, science, mathematics, reading nonfiction, but he's also talking about literature. And I take that full to mean that if you don't read a lot, like literature, you're not living the life that you could be living. Like, you don't have as many experiences as you could be having. And I think of all my favorite intellectuals, like Ayn Rand, like Leonard Peikoff. There's another one that I love, who's not as well known, Richard Mitchell, who wrote a book called Less Than Words Can Say. And these are all very literate people. Jordan Peterson, right? And these are all people who, as intellectuals, even though they're a lot of times writing in nonfiction, they're able to draw upon experiences and bring out metaphors, analogies, talk about characters from novels, plays, short stories, poems, poetry quotes, like just that robustness of the experience of life. And that's how I think what differentiates literature as fiction literature from anything else you can experience as an art form, in particular, is that it is about experiences. And that's what I'm so passionate about bringing to people, because I think there is a kind of, you need a key to unlock it. And that key isn't that complicated. It's just a little bit of work and a little bit of basic technique. And you can start unlocking more and more of the great literature of the past.
We'll say a little bit more though on the value of that, because I think it can be non-obvious what you're missing, right? Like, if you haven't gone through the process, like, all right, you're telling me this requires work. Why am I going to put in work? I got a busy life. I'm totally happy just to listen to the Deftones and watch Murder, She Wrote, which are obviously two things that go together, right?
Make integrations.
What can you say about like what is really being added to your life by making this an ongoing thing that you're putting time into?
Well, okay, so I'm going to do this. I've done like hundreds of podcasts. I've never talked about this particular idea that I've just recently come up with. So I'm going to throw it out there, and you can tear it apart if you want. But
All right.
I've thought about a lot of different ways of approaching this. And one unique way is something you talked about at the beginning, actually, about the lackluster sex life most of us have. Most people, I'm not going to talk about myself, most people have. And so, there was a line, or like a question that Leonard Peikoff asks in Eight Great Plays at the very beginning that I've thought about a lot. And I've really, wondered, like, how do you apply something like that? What's the worth of that? And the question is, in Antigone, he asks, and you're reading this, you're not seeing a play, you're not seeing a movie, you're simply reading it on a line. And he asked the question, would you sleep with Antigone? Would you have sex with Antigone? And, I thought about, like, a long time, what is the value of that, right? Well, one conclusion I've come up with, if we think about what we become attracted to, just take as men, right? There are a lot of cliches of how we become attracted to things, to women, I should say, to women, like the types it's from movies, it's from pop culture, it's from workout videos or whatever in the gym, and looking a certain way, behaving a certain way. And there's a reason why so many women try to mold themselves into that, and so many men try to achieve, that kind of woman that looks this way, that talks this way, like a movie person, like someone in the movies. And there's, certain cliches of the superficiality we think of, that these are the characteristics of what's valuable in a woman. But the value of literature, one big value, is being able to, one, form your own values in that and really question that. So that question that Leonard Peikoff asks, you could apply that to all literature, reading Gone with the Wind and thinking about Scarlett O'Hara and asking if you'd really want to date, marry, or like really have sex with her. Like, would that be something you'd be interested in? That forces you to really come, if you really ask that question about Antigone, to ask yourself, well, why? Because you can't see her, right? So that you don't have the physical things that you would normally if it was an actress, like if, Emma Watson played her and you're attracted to Emma Watson, and that's why you want to sleep with her. So you begin to develop in admiring these characteristics, the way she's, opposed to these moral ideas by her elders that are just kind of imposed on her. And she's very, rebellious against this, and the way that she's rebellious and the way that she sticks to her guns, no matter the kind of threats that happen. And the things that she says, and the way, I'm a young person, but that doesn't mean I don't know anything about life and that I'm wrong about this more. Like, if you start being attracted to those kinds of rebellious, but not for the sake of being rebellious, like with a purpose, that I think trains you in the real world to see characteristics like that in other people. And women, if you're, heterosexual male or whatever, looking for a mate. If you don't do that, I think the problem is you could default. And I think that's what most people do, is they default into what they see on the damsel in distress, and that's a lot of male fantasy. And that's the extent of their desire. It's someone who just needs them. And I think that will lead to a lackluster sex life. And if you want that robust sex life where imagine being, you don't have to imagine, but being physically attracted merely to the characteristics of a person, right? Being sexually attracted to those things. And I think that's, I'm not saying that, I am saying that literature can lead to better sex in that way. And I think that's part of, if you're talking about like one practical value, but there's a lot of practical values that are related to that, like lesser, like friends.
Well, I
right?
take it to be what it really is it's training you in, and not training maybe isn't even the right word. It's giving you access to the world of spiritual values that are very hard to isolate in the world without the aid of art. So to take a kind of different case but I think of this similar thing. So one of the things that you get that can be really baffling is, still life paintings, right? But
yeah, I just talked to Luke about that.
Yeah, or that's even more complicated than I want to get into. But let's say landscapes, right?
Okay.
You can think about stepping into that world and how it would feel, and why would it feel that way, and what kind of world do I feel at home in, and what would feel very alienating. And when you're doing that part of what you're doing, I think, is strengthening your vocabulary, not in the technical sense of I know more words, but you have a much richer emotional vocabulary and sense of what you value and don't about the world, and not about any particular thing in the world, but what kind of world do I feel at home in? And that's very hard to do apart from art. And so I think the sex one is just the most intense version. It's what do I value in a soul, and and value in the deepest sense in a soul.
Yeah, and it gives you an ability to see these objectively in a really clear format, which is really difficult to see like when you're just dating someone. When you're dating people, it's really hard to, see what are their characteristics. Like, how would I identify, is this person really honest? Like, to learn that takes time. You have to get them to know them for 6-8 months. Sometimes I think, for me, reading literature gives you those kinds of values. And in terms of the visual arts, I do think there's a kind of training that, like you're saying, in terms of, I think Rand put it in terms of seeing what's important, because in a work of art, anything that an artist puts in there is important by the mere fact that it's included. And this does train your mind to be able to look in essentials. And with the visual arts, now with landscapes and still, I'm not as nearly, on Luke's level with visual arts. I always brought him on to kind of teach me, although I love the visual arts. But, still art and landscape is a little bit more challenging for me in terms of getting the value out of it. I think it's more pure style to some degree that you have to get into it with, like story visuals where you have characters and you're looking at them. For me, it does help teach you, and train you to look at the people around you and see, like, is this person have that kind of sinister look to them? And you don't really see it, because people don't act like that. People aren't outwardly sinister and they don't even think of themselves that way, right? Like, so how do you see that this person might have some nefarious motives and maybe they don't even know about it? That could be detrimental because they aren't somebody you want to do business with, because they might, steal something or cut corners. I think there's a lot of people that do that and think that it's a good thing. How do you identify that in an interview, if you're interviewing them, or, in your life, if you want to bring them into your fold as a friend or anything like that? And that's a really good challenge.
That's a really good example, because I think that's definitely an area where great art separates itself from entertainment. Because in kind of popular entertainment, almost by necessity, you're usually kind of cashing in on certain types, right? It's okay, here's the bad guy with a plan, here's the prostitute with the heart of gold, although that's kind of just butchered romanticism. But you have these kind of preordained, pre-categorized types. And if you're engaging in real literature, one of the things you get is a much richer, more subtle set, and in that sense a much and a deeper exploration of different character traits and types of people. And in that sense, yeah, you're much more honed in terms of your ability to understand people and understand the world than if you just see everything as like, we're in Christmas, right? So, John McClane, good guy, and the Hans Gruber bad guy.
And the
richer palette.
Definitely a richer palette. And I think on that note, it's interesting to me that we're living, it's this BLM, although that's not, it's kind of downplayed. We're living in this culture that's kind of obsessed with racism.
Oh, and just sorry to interject. I've been doing too much work in the energy space. Whenever anybody says BLM, I still to this day go, Bureau of Land Management. What do you?
Yeah, I mean,
anyway, go ahead.
That's yeah. So like with Black Lives Matters, which I know has died down right now. Anyway, this is December 22nd. We're recording. But I think that still is big on people's minds to some degree. It's been a big thing. And it's shocking to me that like I guess it's not shocking anymore, but we have this culture that is outlawing books like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is a book I read long, long time ago by Mark Twain. And one of the things I was, thinking, I was flipping through it, and one of the things that I was remembering, and I'm getting to the point about like how people view racism and why literature I think is so critical, is that one of the reasons people are outlawing is because of the use of the N word, and because they think that, it kind of will perpetuate racism. Like that's their thought. But what I'm confident Mark Twain was trying to do, and what he did really well with the character of Huckleberry Finn and the character of Jim, as they're going, who's a escaped slave, as they're going down the Mississippi River and going on these adventures, is how, and it's a real serious look in a couple hundred of pages that you can observe of the transformation of somebody going from a racist who's a kid growing up in antebellum South with these ideas that black people are less than white people, that they're more akin to animals, and they're okay, that, he has all these moral issues of, should I turn in Jim? He writes a letter that he's going to do, and he's going to send, that's part of what he's experiencing, and you experience it with him. And there's a revelation that I get the chills when I think about this revelation. When Jim talks about how there's a couple of these, but how he misses his family. And Huck is like, you miss your family too? Like, he literally doesn't understand that a black man who, remember, they separated them at this time from family members all the time, that it literally didn't occur to him. And it's so beautifully done. And you need to see that to understand racism, to understand that, and to understand that the way out of it, right? To understand what real racism looks like, that it's integrated into your soul like it is with this kid. And that's why Mark Twain chose children in that sense, is that they're kind of morally safe because it's not their fault, right? They were raised in this environment. But how do you get out of that? Like, how do you really move into a realm of seeing Jim as a person? And there is a kind of person, manness, like becoming a human of Jim throughout this book that I think is, every American should read that. Like that's, when we talk about racism today and we're talking about outlawing something like that because they think that it's going to inculcate racism, when it actually does this. I think it actually does the absolute opposite, especially when taught well by a teacher who points out the characterization and the inner consciousness of Huckleberry Finn, and as he comes to that realization. And there's several other ones, like he plays tricks on Jim, and he starts to see that Jim has an inner world, and he's sad. He's like, you don't do that to friends. Why would you play that kind of trick? And Huck's like, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I didn't think, he literally over time comes to that realization. And today when we talk about racism, like the fact that we're not talking about Ralph Ellison's the Invisible Man, The Color Purple, the Uncle Tom's Cabin, Mark Twain's work, the fact that we're not talking about this corpus of work is, to me, a huge problem in terms of understanding what it looks like. Because again, you cannot look at a person in one behavioral instance, and I see people do this all this time, and it really bothers me. Like I have to say, I've seen somebody do this where they say, there's this white woman and a black man walks into the room and she clutches her purse, and that's racism. And I'm like, it's racism that, against the white woman, because you're assuming something about her soul, that just because one behavior, maybe she's just afraid of you because you're a dude, right? Mm-hmm. Like if I'm, I think about this all the time. When I sit down at a coffee shop, I have my $4,000 laptop, my $3,000, camera, my $2,000 phone. If anybody under the age of 85 who's a male sits anywhere in my vicinity, I'm like moving that stuff over, putting it over my leg. And so, yeah, if you look at that one instance, you might think I'm racist, but I'm not. And to make that assessment is a problem. That's why we need literature, because we need to see the shape of the internal world of a person. And it's absolutely impossible in real life. Like until you meet someone for 20 years. Right? Like that's what it takes. And even then it's flawed. And this, Ayn Rand makes this point all the time. It's flawed. It's kind of flawed because your memory can be flawed. Like it's really hard. It's critical to have that objective, concrete value that you can get in mildly, amount of time, like, 5, 10, 15, 20, War and Peace, maybe like 50 hours. But, some books like Atlas Shrugged, maybe 40 hours or something of reading, but I don't know if it takes that long. I know it takes that long for the reader to do it. I think it's like a 60-hour audiobook. But anyway, so she mentioned this about the role of art in our minds, is that and I think we just have to take it so seriously what she said. And she's not the only person to say this, but it's such a profound statement that you need to visualize concretes over, because life isn't like that. Life is so chaotic that you need art for that purpose.
Well, and just what you said reminded me of just a small thing that maybe people haven't said, but one of the things Leonard Peikoff reported about Ayn Rand is that she really stressed the value of, and she was speaking, I think, primarily in the context of children, but of having heroes from art versus in real life, one of the dangers is that they let you down, and that can be really traumatic. Whereas and she was, I think, speaking precisely in people who were viewing her as like, oh, that's my hero versus John Galt or Dagny Taggart. It's like, why would you put, your kind of what you want to emulate into the hands of somebody who you can't control and have no clue, what you're going to learn about them in a year. And I mean, we've definitely seen that in the past few years of people who were idolized and turned out to be quite wicked in their real life.
I think that's a very important point. Very important.
So that's on literature, and I think it's such a great art to talk about because it's the easiest to see the kind of practical value that one can get out of it. And I mean, for me, along with music, it's my top favorite. But I think poetry, people kind of go, well, why poetry? That just seems like it's not enough to you don't get a story out of it. I mean, even like epic poetry, I guess you could, but usually you're not getting a story out of it in the same way. And it's not like music where you got a cool beat to go with the dope rhymes. What is the special value of poetry, do you think?
So one thing that's challenging is that poetry used to be the realm where you get a lot of what I just said. Novels are only a couple hundred of years old. You used to have to go to verse, and that's when we talk about poetry. The main difference is verse versus prose, and so there's rhyme, there's meter, there's rhythm, there's use of there's kind of untangle. There's the tangling that poets do. And I'll give you an example. I've become obsessed with William Wordsworth, who was one of the early first romantic poets. And I've studied him quite a bit. I'm going to continue to study him. And one of the things that he said when he was in his college years, he went to Cambridge, and he was debating what he wanted to do with his life, right? Which a lot of us do, of course. And he, just like all of us, he had less options. I think we have, but that's a different discussion. But he was debating, and one of the explicit reasons he chose poetry versus becoming a priest or something is because, or I think it would have been law probably, but it's because in his words, it forces you, when you want to get an idea across to an audience, writing poetry forces the reader to reread it and to really digest it and to really work with it. When you read nonfiction or prose or novel, short story, even a play, there's a sense where you kind of just go through it, right? And you kind of just ingest it. With poetry, you absolutely have to work with the language. It is distorted, not in a negative distorted, but it is kind of moved around for meaning, sense, and getting a good example of the rhythm that you get from it that kind of puts rhythm into your soul. About something is the poem Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, I think, which you can't read the whole thing. It's not that long, but I recommend listening to it, which it has this, it's about World War I, and it has this kind of rhythm when you really get to hear it, where it feels like kind of slogging through mud, right, in a war. And that's kind of the theme, and it goes through that. And there's a lot of poetry that kind of has that part of it in there. And so I guess the point I'm trying to make is that it allows you to contemplate language, literature, experiences, life, wisdom, ideas in a completely different format than, even seeing it with a character. Although a lot of poetry, I have to say, I don't quite agree with your assessment that it's not stories. Ballads, that's verse with story. There's a lot of narrative poems that aren't 20-page, an epic poem. Although there are some that are. I mean, take Ulysses, for instance. I mean, that's a character. He's not an event. It's not an action. The Lady of Shalott. There's a lot of stories that are told in these poems that you can then contemplate. And to me, that is the role of art in general, and that's something that you have to be doing. And we talked about this earlier with pop culture, where or pop stuff like movies, where people walk out but they don't contemplate it. And so, in a sense, it's almost like a useless activity that they did. I mean, there's a lot of things you could do with your time. Killing time is something we think about, and sometimes there's a pleasantry you can get in that killing time, right? For 2 hours, watch a movie. But for me, for something to move into art is that it becomes really worthy of contemplation. And when you contemplate it, it really applies to your life, and you can really get things out of it. I think of the poem by Robert Frost that everybody knows, so we don't have to go into it, The Road Less Traveled, and how so many people have taken, the side that I have not, I've taken the road less traveled, and that has made all the difference, right? That's the quote that people mine that poem for. But I think if you read it, that's part of it, and that's really interesting. It also makes you reflect on how we tell stories about ourselves when we're looking back in our memories. Like when we look at the decisions we made in the forks in the road, we sometimes maybe tell a story, and how life has an element, whether you agree with the sentiment or not is different, but life has an element of ambiguity to it. And that the meaning, in a sense, comes from yourself. That's what I take out of that poem. I think that helps you, enhances your life and enhances your understanding of life and experience.
Well, I'm definitely not delved deeply into poetry, but to the extent that I have, and to the extent that I have really first-handedly seen the value, the way I think about it is meaning in moments. Now, this doesn't apply to all poetry, and as you pointed out, there's lots of different kinds of poetry and lots of different values. But to me, the unique value of it is shining a light on things that can go by unnoticed or unmined for meaning. And so just one example that comes to mind, which my friend Lisa Van Dam, who's also been on this show, brought to my attention years ago, is we read a poem. I forget who the poet was, but it was Surprised by Joy.
That's William Wordsworth.
Okay. Yeah. And it's just capturing this thing that we've all experienced in various ways and drawing attention and saying like latch onto that, and get that there's, don't just let that moment go by. I guess an interesting contrast though is my favorite poem, which is Ulysses, which is more just about what is the perspective I want on life to cultivate in myself. And let's see, how would I put that in this context?
Well, it's about a character who doesn't give up, right? By the way, I'm doing an analysis of Ulysses versus a Wordsworth poem that is kind of similar in their epicness. And there's actually an academic who's doing work on the influences of Wordsworth on Tennyson. And I think they are, but I mean, what you're talking about with Ulysses is, this is a character from fiction, and there's this poem that this guy wrote, Tennyson, and it's a wonderful poem about this man who is at the end of his life, and he's now thinking about what he wants to do with whatever remains to him, right? And there's that line at the end that everybody loves, that I love, that is to strive, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, as part of like what drives him as a person. But it may have been a while since you've heard that poem, and this is, so like, are there anything that it does for you in terms of, how it makes you feel, or how it, inspires or motivates you?
Oh, well, so the first thing I'll say is to integrate with what I was saying before, I think poems can capture moments, or they can give you a perspective that you want in a moment. So when I think of Ulysses, it's often that you want that kind of perspective on life that it brings you in a moment. Now, for me, the major thing I resonate with is there that is so he has this contrast with his son, and his
Mm-hmm.
son's like a pretty decent guy, but in effect is just, settles for life as a kind of normal life. And Ulysses' view is like, no, life's not worth living unless it's grand, high, noble. And that's kind of the thing that I like, is that it's I one of the strongest ongoing feelings I have towards life is that I really, really don't like, what's the word? Just conventional,
Mm.
no, quote, normal, like everyday sort of attitude towards things, and people who are conventional and unsurprising and not different than the thousand other of their neighbors that you've met at one time or another. And to me, it's that poem really captures this idea of, to the end of my life, I'm not gonna like settle, even if I, have every reason to, every obvious reason to, for anything less than, you know, if you want to put it in the poem's terms, like high adventure. But
Yeah.
as somebody who, for me, the lack of normality is still sitting in an office, writing, is definitely not venturing into seas and whatnot. But
Well,
it's that attitude.
yeah, it's the attitude, and you can emulate, and this is one thing you can do with fiction that, I talked about somewhat with being attracted to a physical partner, but there's also just developing your own character by emulating the ideas, thoughts, actions, events in the lives of literary characters, right? And you touch on this with Ayn Rand saying you should, young kids, or in general, you should make heroes out of fiction characters versus real life people, because they'll let you down. But one of the reasons to admire somebody, and let me give you an example in real life. I had the opportunity, as you did, to work with Alex Epstein. And I come from I don't know how to put this, but not the most productive world growing up, right? Where productivity was really, a value. It wasn't. Not to say that my parents were lazy. I don't want to throw them under the bus. They worked hard. They were middle-class people. But like productivity as such was not a value that was in the household. And so it's something, laziness is something I struggle with all the time. It's a default. If I don't put structures in place, if I don't do things, I'm going to default to where I'm not going to be working as hard, just generally. For me, one of the reasons I wanted to work with Alex is he's one of the more productive people I've ever met, right? And in an intellectual manner. And so by just being around that, by admiring that characteristic, by admiring him, by seeing him, by sitting with him as he worked, because I got to do that when we lived in the same house for a while, that made me better, right? That made me more, that upped my productivity level. It's why in like fighting, they tell you the plus minus equals type thing, where you should fight with somebody who's better than you, fight with someone who's the same level as you, and fight with someone who's below you. The fighting with someone above you is to up your game in a sense. And to me, that's what the emotional reaction of admiration does. Is you feel this admiration for something, and that guides you toward that thing that you're trying to achieve, right? And that this is what I want to be more like. That's what admiration is. It's like this. I want that. I want to be a better basketball player. You saw the I don't know if you saw the Michael Jordan documentary.
Oh yeah.
That's kind of what that was his role in a sense for a lot of the people around him, is he was this kind of centralized, here's this guy that everybody, they may kind of hate on him and say stuff about him, but they all admire him. That's one thing I think you got. And that upped all of their games. I think with Steve Jobs, with all great people, you see where it's like you admire this thing and you become better because of it. And I think that's true even of fiction, right? Like you could do that with fiction where you can admire or disdain. I think of these as like sails on a ship or rudders or whatever, where it's like you have to kind of direct things, and disdain is a good thing too. Like I disdain these things, so I'm not going to do that. When I see that in myself, I'm like, ugh, Kirk, why'd you do that? Like, why are you doing this? Why are you acting that way? And we've all done this. And this is another deep role that literature plays is in self-reflection, which is something I don't think we do enough of. I assume, based on how my conversations with people, it's very hard for me to get inside someone's head, of course, but I think we can all do more of self-reflection. But to do self-reflection, you can't do the cliche looking in the mirror and saying, I'm a wonderful person and everybody loves me. And it's like that kind of cliche thing where it's like, that's self-reflection. Self-reflection, I think, has to come from you see some characteristic that you're like or that you're not like and that you want to, attain or you want to avoid. And reading literature. Now, poetry, I think, can do this as well. It can give you a sense of self-reflection. It can give you the vocabulary. It can train you in the experiences. I think, to answer a question you asked a while ago, one of the things that poetry does more than even novels and stories to some degree is it does quickly, or not quickly, but it can transport you in a short period of time that you can really hold in front of your head or in front of your face. That's much more difficult to do with a novel that will take a long time. And there's a lot to process, right? You think about like a 5-10 stanza poem can give you the same kind of resonating experience. I think when you had Lisa Van Damme, she talked about this, but I got this book recommendation from her, Sound and Sense, and she talks about like the eagle. And there's a poem called The Eagle by Tennyson. And part of what that poem's doing is making you feel like an eagle. And that's an experience worth having, is the feeling of being like an eagle, of soaring through the sky. And that's what Tennyson does that you cannot get from information. You could read every encyclopedia entry on eagles. You can read any, you can learn all about all the different types of eagles, but you'll never experience it. But poetry can give you a taste of that experience. So that's my overall little spiel on poetry. One of them. There's a lot more, by the way. But
yeah, no, I like that a lot. And one question then is, for people who are kind of setting out on this journey, where even to find resources that are worth, going into. I'll put it in personal terms, which is I have a deep paranoia, which is not a good thing to have, about like wasting my time on something that will in the end not have been worth the investment, right? So it's kind of like, all right, until I have very strong reason to think like this is a gold mine. But then the problem is it's very hard to discover new treasures. You're basically just relying on now thankfully I have a bunch of advisors who help me find new things and do a lot of the dirty work. But nevertheless, what's some advice on what people who want to get more out? Because as much as we're talking about the virtues of literature and poetry, what comes to our minds are the good examples, but there's a lot of garbage out there too. Yeah. So how do you think about that issue of finding things that are worth tangling with?
Well, this is a question that a lot of literary critics have actually talked about. So when we think of literary critics, which I think I'm developing myself into one to some degree, it's something that I never thought of, but as a career, it's becoming more what I'm attracted to. And one of the things I've learned from them is that the goal is not to tear apart and criticize all of, every piece of literature that you get. It's actually to help teach people how to look. And I think Samuel Johnson said who was a literary critic, who said something like, you're supposed to help the reader make explicit what is implicit. And that's part of what a literary critic does. And part of why I'm going into this is the idea that part of my job is to help you find good stuff. That's part of what I think, and what is good and why it's good, and to teach you. And then there have been movements where it's like there's the classicist literary critics, and then there's the romanticist, like William Hazlitt, like Samuel Taylor Coleridge. These are major critics of the Romantic period who they wrote all this stuff to kind of talk that this is the type of stuff that's good. This is what you need to be looking at, and how it's different from classicism and so on. Now, to answer your question on a more specific basis that might be helpful is, well, you talked about the advisors, but in your own life, you've already kind of indicated one thing that one interest and passion you already have for one poem. and that's Ulysses. Now, I don't know if you have other poems, but I would, if you're interested, if you like that author, I would, say read more of that author. So if you like Tennyson wrote volumes of stuff. There's lots of stuff, and you can look through it, and it could be worthwhile. Read In Memoriam. It's a little bit more of read. I don't know if you've read The Lady of Shalott. Read his early. There's a ton of stuff. So I recommend that. Just kind of following your instincts that you like this. There's something about it you like. Read that poet and try to get to know that poet. And then, I would say look like you like Surprised by Joy, so look at William Wordsworth. And there's an interest of if you have a small interest, a taste of it, delve into it. I think you do that with other areas of your life, and I think in literature it's the same thing. And we have a tendency of I think there's this big scope of millions of books we can look into, but really at the end of the day, just follow your instincts, follow what you like, and then the next thing I would say is expand what you like. And one way to do that is get anthologies of poetry, and just every once in a while, and it could be every couple of weeks, every couple of months, whatever, whenever you just sitting around, you have it on your coffee table, whatever, just kind of open it up and just read a poem at random. Read one that just, in this anthology. If even you don't even, I'm not even saying we're engaged with it. I'm just saying, just read it and see if anything at all piques your interest. If not, move on. And then something will eventually pique your interest.
I mean, that reminds me of Luke's advice for going to museums, which is basically you just do a quick, it doesn't work exactly for the Louvre, but for most, do a quick, walk around, find the handful of things that jump out at you as intriguing, right? So it's,
yes.
And then really mine those. And I think that, I think that's really good advice, for a lot of things. And, it's do some random sampling, and what jumps out at you can be a really good place to explore.
And if I can add one thing to that, I would also challenge you and your audience to, if you're like me, to read world literature of all eras and try to expose yourself at least a little bit to it. And this is poetry, short stories, plays as well. And this is something that Peikoff talks a lot about. He talks about it in 8th Grade Plays. He talks about it in, what was the one, I always forget the title, the philosophically bad but good literature. That one.
Oh, the survival value of a great but philosophically false art.
Which almost all art is. A lot of it's philosophically false. And so I've talked to a lot of people, and there's barriers to, but I think reading world literature is so critical to seeing, like if you study history, if you're interested in that, but if you're interested in humans, in man, Alexander Pope said the proper study of humanity is man, or mankind, right? And that's, world literature holds so much of that study from different eras and different perspectives. And I think there's a value outside of just the pure getting a pleasure from it. And I guess the point that I'll kind of end this rant with the idea of what Peikoff is talking about, in particular in the philosophy of education, that we all probably missed if you're like me and you went to public school, where he talks about mathematics, science, history, literature as the four after the 3 R's in primary education and secondary education, those 4 things. And he puts literature as in world literature, and we could talk about his reasons if depending on your time, but that, I think there is a critical human value that is absolutely missed, that we don't get, that, I try to challenge people to try reading things. And I do have some recommendations for people if they need it, but, try reading the Iliad. This is, if you haven't read it before, by the one that I've read multiple different translations. The one that Peikoff gives that I agree with is the E.V. Rieu, I-R-I-E-U translation. Read the Iliad, read the Odyssey. Just try them, right? Just try reading them. Give it a shot. Once in a while, just pick up something that is considered a classic, right? That, it's considered something great, and just try it and give it a shot. Really try to ingest it. And I think there's a lot of values that we've talked about that are there. And then there are other values that we haven't talked about that, you can only get, there's no amount of talking. I could talk for 27 hours straight and I cannot convince you. Only the literature can convince you. Only reading it and experiencing for yourself can convince you of its value and doing the work. So,
yeah, I agree with that. Do you have any thoughts on how to encourage more great production of art? In other words, how to create a culture that longs after. And I don't mean
that's my goal in life. Yeah.
I mean, and I'll tell you just why that thought occurs to me. I remember years ago when Luke was first starting to talk about his method, or when I was getting to know him, one of the things that I told him that I was excited by, I was like, if people knew how to appreciate art and they had a method, part of what it does is you stop looking at garbage because it's trendy, and
Yes.
it builds your pseudo self-esteem, and you start really going after things that have value. And in effect, if people were empowered with a better method, I think it creates a larger market. And you would see, because there is so much artistic talent in the world, drawn into doing things that are more ambitious, and so that we wouldn't just have to rely on stuff that was created 100 or 200 years ago for the most superlative forms of music and poetry and literature.
Yeah, I mean, that is my fantasy in life, to kind of, even a small sampling. This was the whole motivation behind Troubadour magazine that I'm doing, where I wanted to, and this has been a complete failure on my part. And I'm revamping for 2021 to try to do some new things, but there is a complete failure in terms of attracting writers that I'm trying to, new writers, and publishing their work, which is something that I've wanted to do, is find new writers who want to put out the work. But I've been shocked by two things in this experience. And one is I've been shocked by the amount of writers there are that don't read like world great literature and don't have a sense of that, a sense of the writing that came before them, and really have engaged with it. And I think this is true even of a lot of pop fiction today. Even some better stuff is, there's almost like an excision, a cutting off of all the literature that came before. When you read literature of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, there always is a kind of awareness of the past. And even in the style and the characters, there's Ulysses, for instance, call back to ancient Greece. So that's one thing, is like helping, I've done courses through Troubadour where we would reverse engineer, which is something I learned from the Ayn Rand Institute of Nonfiction, reverse engineer short stories by great authors so people can understand the characterization, the style, the way that they use language to develop a story in general. The one that I do the most is Wakefield by Hawthorne, because I think the style is unique and impeccable and interesting. The character is interesting. The plot isn't some fantastic plot, but it's only like 8 pages. And that's the other reason I choose it. It's very short. But it shows people the kind of, and writers, the kind of work that has to be done in, observing reality and coming up with the language to, project the kind of emotional, thematic style, characters that you want to do. And so my point is simply that that's one of the things that I want to do, but I've learned in trying to do it that education has to be like 90% of it, because it's, and I'm the same way. I'm not trying to say that, I've gotten better, I've done much more than this. I guess I've read a lot more literature, but I'm lacking in science and math. And, I do a little bit with history, but science and math, I'm super lacking. So anyway, my point is that developing that kind of culture is something that I'm very motivated doing, even if it's with like a small cadre of people. That's what I want to do with my life. It's why I write fiction. My first instinct with studying the classics was that would make me a better writer. And so that's why my big motivation for reading it was doing that. And I think it has done that. And one of the things that is interesting about studying Romanticism, which I've been doing a bit recently, especially English Romanticism, but really, the whole movement of what happened in the late 1800s or 18th century, early 19th century, Did I get that right? The late
No,
1700s. Yeah,
you're
so
100 years early.
Yeah, sorry. The late 1700s, early 1800s. There we go. Anyway, so the one of the things that's so interesting is that there was like a movement of artists. Some of them, like during Hernani with Hugo, got in fist fights with old people. That's how passionate they were about their art and about this new movement. Is the old people were like, that's a blasphemy, you can't do that, that's, you're getting rid of Aristotle and all these, excuse me, and they actually bought each other, and young people beating up on old people. And but what's interesting about Romanticism was the kind of reaction to what was going on in the academia at that time, and that they were teaching, this is the only way, you have to do it this way, and the only good culture and values and meaning in life were done thousands of years ago, so just shut up and do this. And there was this like surge of internal personal expressiveness that wanted to get out of it. And this was a movement. Now, my point in all that and studying the movement of Romanticism of that era is that I do sense that there may be something in the culture on a lesser, or I don't know, something in that view. Like I personally, have chosen not, at least so far, to get an MA or a PhD in literature, partially because whenever I look at the programs, I'm like, what the hell are you doing? When I talk to, especially MAs in literature, it's just baffling to me that they've not read, anything before 1950, basically, it feels like, and it's just like, it's so bad. And it's like, I'm going to spend my time with that. And I think there is a feeling in big parts of the culture. I think Quillette, for instance, is a magazine that started as a kind of reaction against the academia and, a certain kind of intellectual, field. And I think that can be done in the literary field. Like if you're like me, as a writer, I've tried so hard to find magazines that I would be inspired to write for. And I've never found a single magazine that I'm interested in writing for, especially one that, leans toward literature. So part of what I long-term want to do with Troubadour, at least the passion, the mission, is to kind of provide that place for people. And that's what I'm hoping for. And part of that is to bring, the Romanticism as kind of the inspiration for the, and the admiration for the new stuff that we want to do for the future. So that's kind of like, when you ask that question of where, how do you do that? Like in terms of cultivating that today, maybe there's grounds for it now, because there is a kind of an annoyance by academia. Academia has been such a stolid, specialized place of, I don't even know what to call it anymore, but there's been an anger against it amongst people that I think there may be room for that. Maybe.
I hope so.
I hope so too.
I mean, it's something I want to contribute to on whatever scale I can, just because I think it's one of my convictions is that my focus is on, I want a philosophic movement that's really healthy and that is attracting a lot of people. And I don't think that can happen, or let's at least say, I think that is much assisted by making a celebration of great art integral to it, and not just Ayn Rand's books, but that it's a world of exciting ideas about, technological innovations that are making our lives better, and a celebration of life through art that makes each one of our lives deeper. How can people follow your work, follow Troubadour, and all of that good stuff, Kirk?
Yeah, it's all centered around troubadourmag.com. And it's troubadourmag.com. Apparently there is a troubadourmagazine.com. That's not me. That's from a university. So troubadourmag.com. That's where I put everything.
Well, awesome. Really appreciate you coming on. Hopefully we can do this again at some point.
Yeah, whenever.
I'm going to say this publicly just so I remember to do it. And if I forget, which I might, people have to write me and yell at me. I want to link to the interview I did with you and Luke,
Okay.
where I think we had some really interesting discussions about poetry and about sculpture on that. So
Yeah.
Everybody check that out. And until then, it's been good talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks, Don.